Good morning, afternoon, maybe even evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to Jews and Whiteness with Dr. Marc Dollinger, the first lecture of the four-part lecture series, Jews, Race, and Racism, at the San Diego Center for Jewish Culture at the Lawrence Family Jewish Community Center, Jacobs Family Campus. I am Lauren Lidke, the JLearn and Jewish Living Program Manager here at the JCC. I'm so excited to welcome you all today to this wonderful and really significant lecture with Dr. Dollinger. So before we get started, just a couple pieces of Zoom protocol that I always like to mention. Please, with all of our virtual programs, please be sure that you understand your camera is on, and that's wonderful. We definitely encourage you, if you're comfortable, to keep it on, but just know that we are all able to see one another. Also, please remain muted unless there is an opportunity to unmute and ask a question. If that time comes, Dr. Dollinger will absolutely signal that time. For right now, please stay muted just so we can avoid any background noise coming through, and just out of respect for our lecturer and everybody else attending today. I also want to send a really big thank you to all of our incredibly generous underwriters of the JLearn Department and the Greater San Diego Center for Jewish Culture and the Lawrence Family JCC. It's through their generosity, truly, that we are even able to put on programs like this and bring them to the community. So thank you so much. We are extremely grateful. So now I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Marc Dollinger, who is a member of the Jewish Studies faculty at San Francisco State University and holds the Endowed Research Chair in Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility. Dr. Dollinger is also an author of several books. His most recent book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s, reaching national attention. And then Dr. Dollinger is also a really fantastic California historian. And so we are so fortunate to have him here with us for so many reasons. So without further ado, Dr. Dollinger, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Lauren and Abby. Thrilled to be here, even virtually, to San Diego. As you're going to find out in a moment, I was raised in the southern suburbs of LA, and my cousins and aunt and uncle lived in Del Cerro. So I did get down to San Diego a lot, and I'm looking forward to getting more travel. But let me just jump right in with the PowerPoint. And oh, yes, here it is, Malaga Cove Intermediate School. On the beautiful Palos Verdes Peninsula, where I was raised, and about 30 minutes south of LAX. And I don't want to mention the name of my sixth grade English social studies teacher, in case anyone here might know Miss Lyle. Miss Nancy Lyle, she used to drive the red Carmen Ghia in the faculty parking lot. No worries, I have actually given this lecture to Miss Lyle, so she has given her official approval. When I tell you that when I was in the sixth grade in 1927 in California State Public Schools, we had a unit where we learned about a group of people who were called Mongoloids. And the Mongoloids, we were taught, had slanted eyes and yellow skin. We learned about a group called the Negroids, and the Negroids had flat lips and a dark complexion. The Caucasoids had white skin and average features. Now, do you notice there's a lot of vowels in those words, the oid, O-I-D suffix? It's almost as if you add a lot of vowels to a word, it sounds more scientific. And if it's more scientific, then it must be, you know, more true and accurate. Well, can you imagine what it was like in our unit test? True or false? Mongoloids have dark skin. Well, if you're a good middle school student, you knew that was false, because Mongoloids had yellow skin. It was Negroids that had dark skin. We had matching, and matching, I'm not sure if they do it anymore, but back in the day, you'd have a sheet of paper and you'd have Mongoloid, Caucasoid on one side, you'd have the traits on the other, and you take your number 2 pencil, of course, and you draw a line across connecting the word. And then you had fill in the blank, right? Caucasoid has blank features. And then you'd have to remember that that was average. Jews and whiteness are subject for today. For those of you taking notes, here is our question. Are Jews white? And I put in parentheses, white presenting Jews, because really this is part of our discussion today. I'll just use myself as an example. If you kind of look like me and you're white presenting, are you white and what are the implications? Welcome as well, by the way, those of you joining us for the 4-lecture series. And I want you to know that each of these is building on the last one, which means we're going to do what's called a spiraling curriculum, where every week we'll go deeper and deeper to learn more and more. It's also designed for your friends who want to show up next week because they missed today. They can still do that. You'll be able to jump in at any point, even if you weren't here the week before. Here's my thesis. Jews, more than any other American ethno-religious group, maintain an ambivalent, if ever-changing relationship to whiteness. Over time, place, and person, its very definition proves contested. Ultimately, Jewish whiteness exposes the dynamics of privilege and the powerful, sometimes even destructive ways it plays out in American Jewish life. So a triggering question. We often get those affirmative action forms you have to complete. And the question, we have to check, which ethnic or racial group you're in. And there's a line that says white. And then there's a line that says other, and then it has a blank. So this is rhetorical. This is not for the chat. Do you check, if you're assuming you're white presenting right now, do you check white or do you check other and then write in the word Jewish? So what we're going to do today is define whiteness, do a quick historical overview of Jews and whiteness, and look at its implications. And then at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. So feel free to send Lauren your questions in the chat. All right, defining whiteness. And this is kind of a challenge to think about. And that is that whiteness is not just a biological thing. It's not literally the color of your skin. It's also a sociological thing. It's about a person's relationship to power. The more power we have, the more white we are. I think the best way to illustrate this is imagine your great-great-great-grandparents, however many you need to get 16 ancestors, right? Let's assume there's a person with 15 of those ancestors from Italy and the 16th from Ireland. What are you? I'm guessing you're Italian. Probably have an Italian name. You're probably, Roman Catholic. You've probably got Irish cultural traditions. Italian cultural traditions. Maybe somewhere in there that one Irish ancestor gave you something from Ireland, but pretty much you're Italian. Let's take those same 15 Italian ancestors, but now let's make the 16th from Africa. What are you now? In America, you're Black. You're Black because we have something called the 1-drop rule. 1 drop of African blood makes you Black, even though you're 15/16 Italian, just like the other 15/16 Italian. And with this, we have to see the definition of whiteness and race is not just biological, but also, the fancy term is social construction of race, which is to say that who gets to be called white and who doesn't get to be called white and who gets to be privileged from their whiteness is actually determined by our society, by America. And intellectually, I love studying white Jews because I think that this is actually the most fascinating group to look at what is white and what isn't white. So here's a triggering word for many white American Jews. The word is quotas. American Jews tend to not like the word quotas because if you learned in school in the 1920s, there were a lot of anti-Semitic quotas. An infamous letter from the president of Harvard University, right, who didn't want that many Jews admitted to Harvard. So because quotas are anti-Semitic, Jewish organizations have been opposed anytime quotas get put in anywhere. So in the 1960s, when President Lyndon Baines Johnson and the Great Society proposed quotas because affirmative action programs weren't getting the job done, almost every Jewish organization opposed Johnson's plans for quotas because of their anti-Semitic nature. Well, here's the problem with that particular argument. In the 1920s, quotas were instituted to keep white people in power and keep people who were not considered white out of power. That's why Jews couldn't get into Harvard, even though they'd earned their place, because the quotas prevented them from coming. In the 1960s, though, the goal of the Great Society was to flip it. In the 60s, quotas were meant to bring people of color into power. And if anything, to try to challenge the power of white people in America. So if you were, let's say, a white Protestant in the 1920s, you loved quotas because they helped get you into Harvard disproportionately. If you're a white Protestant, you hated the quotas in the 60s. If you were self-interested Black, you hated them in the 20s and you loved them in the 60s. I think white American Jews are the only group that hated quotas both times. How is it that white Jews can be on the wrong side of quotas when quotas flipped between the 20s and the 60s? Because, and here's the thesis for today, Jews became white. Sometime between the 1920s and the 1960s, Jews went from being outsiders without power in America to insiders with power. They achieved whiteness. And I'm going to start with the work of my colleague, Professor Eric Goldstein at Emory University. And he has the leading book on this topic, and I recommend it if you're looking for some reading. It's called The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity. And a good piece of today is going to be coming from the thesis of his book. The other really good book on this topic, if you're interested in reading, is by Professor Karen Brodkin, now Professor Emerita from the Anthropology Department at my alma mater, UCLA. And I love the title of her book, How Jews Became White Folks, and what that means, what that says about race in America. So I'll share with you, if you're only going to get one book, Professor Goldstein's book is the best scholarly treatment of it. It was his doctoral dissertation at University of Michigan before he turned it into the book. And Professor Brodkin is sort of part memoir, part book. So it's written, I think, in a style which is an easier read and really reflects on what her growing up was like in the 50s and 60s, and then how that sort of played into Jews becoming white. For my students, I actually take a couple chapters, what I think are the best chapters from each book, and then I show them. So let's go through American Jewish history. Well, we'll start in the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was the end of Reconstruction in 1877 until the turn of the 20th century in 1901. So in the late 19th century, Jews were not considered white. Now, when I say Jews, I'm talking about white presenting Jews like myself. Jews are not considered white. Normally, if Jews are not considered white, it's a bad thing. But Professor Goldstein argues it was actually a good thing, because Jews were considered genetically predisposed to be people who love to study. And what's wrong with being known in America as a genetic group that loves to study? Jews were known for their hard work. Jews were part of what would later be described as the Judeo-Christian ethic. And that is that since Christianity had its root in Judaism, Jews were inherently friendly to Christianity, were assimilable. That means they could become Americans. They could become part of what this pluralist democracy should be. To be gendered about it, Jewish men were seen as being good husbands. And perhaps most important, in the late 19th century, Jews were temperate. They didn't drink. And if you're sort of a white middle-class Protestant elite in America, if your group was seen as a group that did not consume alcohol to excess, they really liked you. So here we have a fascinating irony. Jews were not white. Jews were marginalized as a people of color, yet it turned out to be a blessing to American Jews. Sadly, that changed in an instant, and you probably imagined this coming. In the progressive era, this is Walter Lippmann's famous 1915 book, I believe is when he published it, Drift and Mastery. Jews were still not considered white in the early 20th century, but now the qualities associated with Jews went from really good qualities to really bad qualities. And this is because of the eugenics movement. You may have heard about eugenics. They called it scientific. We have to call it pseudoscientific. It wasn't real science, but they thought it was real science at the time. In the best possible way, they thought by sort of studying, different groups, gene pools, they could find ways to improve our lives, make us more healthy, ultimately come up with a better country through marriages and children. And all too quickly, eugenics was racist, it was sexist, it was anti-Semitic. Because now Jews were considered genetically inferior to white Christians in America. So now until 1919, 1920, Jews are not white and it's a bad thing. This is William Z. Ripley's book, believe it or not. Okay, that's my Ripley's Believe It or Not joke. I appreciate the couple people that are smiling. My undergraduates don't get the joke, but actually has no relationship to Ripley's Believe It or Not. Sadly, Ripley was a respected anthropologist, and this book came out in 1899. And if you look at the title, The Races of Europe, let's just assume Europe is white people. But according to Ripley, the white people in Europe actually are divided into different racial categories. And here are the three racial categories. And once again, Teutonic, lots of vowels, right? Remembering my 6th grade class. A Teutonic European was smart, democracy-loving, and very successful. It won't be a surprise to you to know the Teutonics were the Northern Europeans, the British, the Scandinavian countries, France, Germany. These were the genetically predisposed white Northern Europeans who had the best possible dispositions. The second group was the Alpine. And of course, this is going to be like Switzerland, Austria. Now, good news, they're genetically predisposed pretty well. I mean, bad news, they're not Teutonics. They're not as good as the people to the north, but at least they're not those Mediterraneans, the Italians, the Greeks, and by the way, the Semitic stocks, Eastern European Jews, were placed in this lower category. So what the races of Europe described was what we're now going to call the social construction of race, where only the Teutonics are truly white, and the Alpine, Mediterranean, and Semitic folks are not. Now there's a problem, well, there's a lot of problems with this. One problem with the Mediterraneans being idiots, the Italians invented the Renaissance. How could you be of such a low genetic stock and have Michelangelo and Da Vinci amongst your ancestors? Well, the scientists, being good scientists that they were, figured this out, and they said, look, we have concluded that the Italians are idiots except for art. Now, they didn't know why it was they were so good in art, but they promised to study it more to figure that out. This book was published in 1899. Germany was a Teutonic nation in 1899, but what we now call World War I, the Great War, was caused by Germany. And how could a Teutonic nation cause such a disastrous war? And of course, being the good pseudoscientists that they were, Ripley demoted Germany from Teutonic to Alpine after World War I. So not that you would go read this book, but if you find a printing of the book after World War I, Germany is in the Alpine category and not in the Teutonic. This book was followed by Madison Grant in 1916, a natural scientist, a lawyer. Once again, a book title that gives the thesis, The Passing of the Great Race. There was a great race. And now it's going away. And it's going away in 1916. And this is not good for the Jews, because if we know about Eastern European immigration, it starts in the 1880s. It all but ends in 1921, which we'll get to in a moment. So 1916 is really at the height of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. And because of this Semitic people coming into America, well, here's what Madison Grant wrote. Intermarriage with these new immigrants, he said, was destroying the genetic stock of America. Unless the United States excluded all inferior racial and ethnic groups, he warned, the superior Nordic strain, the source of rulers, organizers, and aristocrats, would be swamped by what he called the weak, the broken, and the mentally crippled. And it gets worse. The KKK, which was around in Reconstruction, came back in the 1920s. But it was different in the 1920s than it was in Reconstruction. The motto of the Klan of the 20s was 100% Americanism. And I think that's key, that they used 100%. That's a scientific phrase, percentages, right? And now this is marrying eugenics, or the pseudoscience of eugenics, which is anti-Semitic, with this notion of what it means to be an American. You are an American only if you are a pure blood American. And if you've read the book Caste, you know, the New York Times bestseller, you'll learn that Hitler actually got his ideas on eugenics from the United States, right? And he transferred it back across the Atlantic. So this is a rhetorical question because we don't have the chat open, but like, what state in the Union would be the biggest state of the Klan? And we would think it's Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana. The most popular state for the Klan of the 20s was Indiana. The second most popular state was Colorado. This is the Midwest, the heart of America, now embracing the idea that Jews are not white, that Jews have an inferior genetic stock, and if Jews intermarry with native-born white Protestant Americans, it's going to destroy the future of the country. Oh yes, the skull experiments of the 1920s. Who's smarter? White men, white women, black men, or black women? So the scientists, pseudoscientists of the 1920s decided to test what they called cranial capacity. Cranial capacity, those are fancy words for how big's your brain, right? Now, it turns out how big your brain is doesn't actually tell how smart you are. But in these days of pseudoscience, that's what it was. So they went and got a skull from each of these four groups. They cut off the top of the skull. They filled it with marbles. Oh, no, that doesn't sound scientific enough. They filled it with beads. And then they counted the beads to determine who was smarter. Now, ignore the fact that they self-selected skulls before they got started. And ignore the fact that they added a few more beads where they wanted to. You never guess who won the smartest competition of the 1920s. It was white men, followed by white women, followed by black men, followed by black women. And I just want you to know, right, that if you went to college in the 20s, you did not study this as an example of racism and sexism. You study this as scientific truth. And I would argue this is a shadow of what I learned in Miss Lyle's 6th grade ESS class at Malaga Cove Intermediate School, right? And that was, I will tell you, 1976, I'll date myself. Even in the 1970s in public education in the state of California, we were still teaching the remnants of this kind of, you know, eugenic stuff. Somebody heard one of these talks who actually was teaching in California public schools at the time and gave me actually the name. She remembered the curriculum. She gave me the name of the curriculum. So I thought, wow. All right. So let's go to the 1920s then, deeply. Eugenics strengthened through the 20s. Jews were now facing the worst discrimination they had in the United States. And of course, they were facing it because they were not considered white. The social construction of racial privilege excluded Jews. In 1917, this was sort of the first federal measure. The United States Congress, trying to deal with all these Southern and Eastern European immigrants, they engaged a literacy test. You had to pass a literacy test to get admission to the United States. This is the first time European immigrants needed to, jump through a hoop to become an American citizen. And of course, I want you to see how this follows the two books we mentioned, in terms of federal policy. I learned, though, as I was reading this literacy test, that they allowed you to take it in your native language. And I thought, okay, well, that's great, because I'm thinking of the English only stuff we've had here in the state of California over the decades. So clearly, this was not an English only measure. This was really sensitive to the cultural and linguistic backgrounds of the immigrants, because Jewish immigrants could take the literacy test in Yiddish. Well, I explained this to one of my professors in grad school, and he kind of laughed at me and said, no, you kind of missed the point, right? Because what the literacy test was really doing was testing one's genetic predisposition to intelligence. It was rooted in this awful anti-Semitic and sexist eugenics movement. You see, if a Jewish person was such an idiot that they couldn't learn their own language, Yiddish, how on earth would they ever learn English? How on earth would they ever parent a child with a Christian American, and without fear that the child is going to forever ruin the genetic purity of America? In fact, the literacy test of 1917 was horrifically anti-Semitic, because it had the assumption that Jewish immigrants were idiots. And they were idiots because they were Jews, and therefore they weren't white. It got worse. In 1921, the US Congress in a lame duck session is so upset about all these new immigrants coming that they passed what they called the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. So it used to be that anyone who wants to come to America could come from Europe. And then it was, you could only come if you could pass the literacy test. But now, for the first time, they put in a quota of the number of European immigrants. And I want you to know, like, all these people are presenting as white. These are white Europeans, but they aren't considered white in the 1920s. Now, in 1921, we'd done the 1920 census, but it wasn't finished yet because we didn't have computers, right, to do it. So they had to go back to the 1910 census. So here was the deal. 3% of the members of your group from the 1910 census, which means every 100 Italians that were in America in 1910, you get 3 Italian immigrants per year. And for Jews, it was Russia and Poland, it was an emergency act because they knew that this was just to try to, stem the tide of immigration. By 1924, they decided they could do the more permanent plan. And so the first thing they realized was 3%, they were way too nice. They dropped it from 2% to 2%. By 1924, the 1920 census was now available, so they used the 1890 census. Wait a minute. Did he just say that the 1920 census was ready, so they used the 1890 census? That makes absolutely no sense. It makes no sense at all, and that's what they did. Because sadly, it makes perfect sense if we see this as anti-Semitic not being white. Because if you could have 2% of what America looks like in 1920, or 2% of what America looked like in 1890, and you're a eugenicist in the United States Congress, which one are you going to take? Most Jewish immigration didn't start till after 1890. 1890 to 1920 was the time of massive Jewish immigration. So by moving the census back to 1890, they were able to racially engineer the gene pool of America. The Immigration Act of 1924 was racist and anti-Semitic at its core. And it gets even worse. The ratio for Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the quota, after 1924 was 65,721 immigrant spots per year. So let's just imagine it's like 1925 and you're hanging out in London and you're thinking, gee, I'd like to move to New York City. And you go to the US Embassy. where there are 65,721 spots each and every year waiting for people like you. 85% of all the quota spots went to Northern Europe. Effectively, every single Northern European that wanted to immigrate to America after 1921 could do it. Italy had 5,802 slots. Now, Italy, the migration pattern was basically young single men coming over to earn money, hopefully to go back to Italy to buy land. But if we just translate that to Jews, right, to that small number, you can't even get family reunification with that 2% number from 1890. Effectively, it all but ended Southern and Eastern European immigration, while all but permitting Northern immigration. This was the end of the Golden Door. This was the end of the Emma Lazarus poem on the Statue of Liberty. And it was rooted in the idea that Jews were a threat to America, and that if they intermarried with Christians and had children, that would ruin the future of America. So now let's look in the post-World War II era, and now we're going to look at Professor Brodkin's book, because here is where she argues it all changed. Jews became white. Between 1945 and 1960, anti-Semitic barriers had dropped. Now, clearly there's going to be anti-Semitism after 1960, and sadly, of course, we'll maybe get to this later in Q&A. The last 5 years has been the worst anti-Semitism, in the last few weeks, even terrible. But it's not been sociological, meaning individual sporadic acts of anti-Semitism have not kept Jews as a group behind like it did before World War II. Many of the restrictions on vacations and home, vacation locations and home ownership had also eased. Jews were now buying homes in the white suburbs, and undergraduate schools, the proliferation of large public universities was now giving pretty much any Jewish person that wanted to and had enough money to go get a college degree, even a graduate degree. Jews were now, and here's where it's key, Jews were now admitted to whites-only places. And this is going to be a bit of a foreshadowing for actually the next 3 weeks. I mean, all of the next 3 weeks, we're going to continue to talk about the fact that in the 1950s, Jews leapfrogged ahead of Blacks and Latinos and other people of color because, as Brodkin argues, Jews became white in this time period. Jews achieved integration. They moved into home ownership, and it seems to be really great. It gets complicated, though, because even though anti-Semitism waned throughout the 50s, racism didn't. And when Jews joined the civil rights movement of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., they were actually joining as white people. And while, by the way, many Jews are internalizing the notion of anti-Semitism and our own history of what it's been like to be Jewish, in history and Jewish in America, we don't enter the civil rights movement until the time that Jews are now understood as being white. So from perspectives of many in the Black community, Jews were now jumping over the Black community into their own whiteness in the suburbs. And now we have a difficult question, and this is going to be really the focus of week 4 for us in more detail. How would Jews respond to their newfound whiteness? Well, in the suburbs, the first thing that happened was, well, those anti-Semitic covenants in the mortgages. It used to say, I will not sell this house to a Black family or a Jewish family. You had to sign on the dotted line. Well, they got rid of the I won't sell to a Jewish family, but they didn't get rid of the I won't sell to a Black family. So Jewish families were signing those restrictive housing covenants. In 1948, the US Supreme Court ruled those covenants unconstitutional, but there were still informal ways that these white suburbs remained all white or mostly all white. And since we had neighborhood schools, Jewish parents were sending their kids to all white segregated schools, and the Brown decision was seen as something that applied to the South, but not to the North. And we probably all know stories when the first Black family moved into the neighborhood, all the Jews, moved out to someplace else. The 1950s was the time of the greatest capital campaigns for synagogues and JCCs, because they were all building new structures out in the suburbs. And here's the question. Let's just take JCCs. Would JCCs be open to Blacks? Now, we would need to see Black Jews at the time to see what would happen in that scenario. And I haven't found any evidence to see if it was tested in that way. In 1951, the ADL did do a survey. They found half the JCCs in 1951 only admitted Jews, so we don't know if they would have admitted Blacks if they weren't Jewish. But of the half that admitted ostensibly anybody, half of those were racially exclusive. So more and more we discover that Northern Jews are beginning to emulate white America more than moving away from it. And this is going to be the focus of next week's talk as well. And then let's look at the contemporary scene. What's going on today? Jews now enjoy power and privilege, which is to say that we've done really well in America. America has been great to us. We're disproportionately represented, among college students and graduate students and professors and in business and in government and pretty much anywhere we look, we are outperforming our numbers in the overall population. And this is creating intergroup tensions, which our JCRCs are very much engaged with, because people of color often get frustrated with Jews, white presenting Jews, because Jews are white, but they won't admit it. A JCRC brought me in to give this talk, actually, because they said that when their lay leadership was going into meetings with Black and Latinx community leaders, they would walk into the room thinking, brothers and sisters, like, we're with you because we're Jews and we're not white. And the Black and Latinx community leaders sitting at the table would go, okay, white people just walked in the room. And the fact that the Jews were not self-identifying as white, even though that they were understood to be white, was causing issues between the communities. So I'm an educator, and I like to think that if only we learn about one another, things will be better. And I hope that it is true. But the issue of whiteness actually moves us away from education and into power, which is to say that when we get access to power, and we as any group in America, we then change our particular status. And Jews achieved power after World War II in the 1950s. So how do we know when it is that Jews achieved power? How do we know when Jews became white? For this, I go to Milton Gordon, a sociologist, 1964 book called Assimilation in American Life. He was not talking about Jewish immigrants. He was talking about European immigrants. He didn't say European, he just said immigrants, but that's how it went in 1964 when you were writing. And when he wrote, he said that a new immigrant group goes through 7 stages of becoming American. And we know maybe from our own family stories, like how it goes. Like a lot of people change their names, you change your religious practice, you learn English, right? These are all things that you do to assimilate. The question I ask from Gordon's book, what's level 7? What's the last thing that happens to an immigrant group when they know they've become American? And I'll answer this in a gendered way. They may say they really love you, but would they let you marry their daughter? It turns out, according to Gordon, intermarriage is level 7. A group makes it in America when their intermarriage rates rise, because when white Christian America welcomes a Jewish son or daughter-in-law into the family warmly, then we know we have made it. So especially to those of you in Jewish leadership, I say, we can't have it both ways. We can't want to be free and equal citizens in the United States, enjoying all the privileges of citizenship on the one hand, and then argue against intermarriage on the other. In fact, the highest rates of assimilation, and they come into California from the rest of the United States, is a sign of the highest level of Jewish success. And I'll say the highest level of Jewish whiteness with this. So ultimately, and this is David Beale's award-winning book, Power, Powerlessness in Jewish History, this is really our question, because Jews have been in America white and powerful. And Jews have been in America non-white and non-powerful. As a scholar of Jewish studies, I love studying Jews around this question of power and powerlessness, whiteness and not whiteness, because I think we might be the only group that's both white and non-white simultaneously, that's both powerful and powerless, that both is a victim of anti-Semitism while also enjoying disproportionate power. Like, what on earth do we do? Mostly we yell at each other. I'm noting on social media these days, trying to figure out what we are. But I want to make it as dramatic as I possibly can. And I want to look at two dates, 1945 and 1948. 1945, the end of the Shoah, the end of the Holocaust, Auschwitz. And we learn, the world learns of the attempted genocide of the Jews. 90% of Polish Jews are killed in the Shoah. 1948, the establishment of the state of Israel, the creation of a Jewish army. Since I'm tenured, I know you're recording this, Lauren, but I do have tenure, so I'm going to say it. Israel has the atom bomb. They didn't have it in 1948. They have somewhere between 100 and 200 of them. Therefore, Jews are a military force. Jews have the power to literally destroy the world. And this happened in just 3 years. Between 1945 and 1948, to go from Auschwitz to atom bombs. I argue so much of the fight around Jews and whiteness today is over the fact that we're still assimilating what it is like to have gone from near total powerlessness to near total powerfulness in just 3 short years. For guidance, actually, I want to show you this image. This is a YouTube video. If you just put Israeli Air Force Auschwitz in YouTube, you can find it. These are 3 Israeli F-16 fighter jets flying over Auschwitz. It is like, I've seen it 50 times. I still cry every time I watch it. If a picture can tell 1,000 words, what if there was an Israeli Air Force in World War II? They could have bombed Auschwitz. And here we see a visual depiction of Jewish power, Jewish whiteness, and Jewish powerlessness, Auschwitz below it. And now we'll go to Rabbi Irving Yitz Greenberg, because he has a quote in an article he wrote called The Ethics of Jewish Power, which is my favorite article in all of Jewish studies, not just on this topic, in all of Jewish studies. And I want to walk you through this quote. Power corrupts, but there is no other morally tolerable choice. The alternative is death. This is the lesson the Jewish people learned in the Holocaust. And now we're going to do a Rashi on it. We're going to do a close read. We'll start with power corrupts. All right, let's stop right there. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, one of the preeminent Orthodox rabbis of his generation, is going to acknowledge that when Jewish people get power, Jewish people get corrupted. And I'll spin this to say, when Jews achieved whiteness, we became corrupt. I would like to believe this isn't true. I would like to believe that when Jews get power, we use the power for good things. And that we are, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Remember that line? So Rabbi Greenberg is opening by acknowledging that when Jews become white, Jews became corrupt. All right, what else can you say after that depressing thought? But there is no other morally tolerable choice. Wow. You're going to get power, you're going to become white, you're going to be corrupted, but guess what? You ain't got a choice. All right, I would like to think we have a choice. There is another morally tolerable choice. We can, tikkun olam, right? That's the other morally tolerable choice. Let's use our power to improve the world. Not according to Yitz, to Rabbi Greenberg, because, oh my goodness, the alternative is death. Well, that's depressing. Power corrupts. There's no choice, because if you don't take corrupting power, you're going to be dead. How on earth could you possibly come up with such an outrageous statement? And then, of course, we get to his last line. This is the lesson the Jewish people learned in the Holocaust. Powerlessness is death. Powerfulness is corruption. To be corrupt or to be dead, that's a heck of a choice. Lauren, hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dollinger. That was just absolutely, I'm kind of speechless, admittedly, just because I feel like there's so much still digesting, and it was just absolutely fantastic. I open it up, if now is an okay time, to questions. As we said, the chat, all questions are going to me as the host. So if you do have questions, you can still put them there and I will give them to Dr. Dollinger. But if you have another way, if you would like to raise your hand, we can also have you unmute and speak as well. But we will give a second for people to, if they have any questions, to consider those. Nothing just yet. And I will say, while we are wrapping up and as people think of their questions, most in this group here are registered already for the 4-part lecture series. So we do have the other 3 consecutively over the next few Wednesdays. If you are not and you would like to be, there is absolutely still time to register for the others, either next week or the 2 that come after. So we definitely encourage you to sign up for those, and I will send information in the follow-up email about that. But we definitely encourage you to join us for those as well. Okay, I see that Joni has their hand raised.
Hi, how are you?
Hi,
Dr. Dollinger. Thanks for your talk. I'm a faculty member in a school of education, and actually the Chabad of Poway shooter was a student in my college.
Wow.
So,
wow.
One of the challenges that I have as someone who studies sort of hate and white supremacy and how we teach young children about it, is, we write positionality statements in papers, right? But you also have conversations with colleagues who feel exactly what you're sort of talking about. They feel like we've all gone a little bit corrupt. So I'm sort of wondering how you, in conversation with your colleagues who maybe are not in Jewish studies or who feel like Jews have become corrupt, how do you handle those conversations? And also, how do you write about that sort of in terms of your positionality?
Oh my goodness. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's it.
Wow, thank you, Joni, and for your work, and what a question. Oh my goodness. So part of it we're going to cover in the next 3 weeks, but just to answer direct, this notion of corruption, right? That goes to the heart of it. So I'm in SF State. We got a lot of anti-Semitism. I work closely with the administration to deal with it. Most of ours is from the left. The shooters coming from the right in Poway, But that said, I said, it's a challenge. So for my colleagues who aren't in Jewish studies, it's a challenge for them because Jews are disproportionately powerful, and by Yitz Greenberg's own statement, corrupt, right? Yet that's an anti-Semitic trope. So how on earth do we navigate this? My first book was on Jews and liberalism from the 1930s to the 70s. And I couldn't believe that this is already like a lot of years ago, but no one had ever written a book on Jewish liberalism. And I was just thrilled because you can get a book contract. No one's ever written a book on it, And only after I finished writing it did it dawn on me that the reason no one's gone near it is it really talks about the ascension of Jewish power after World War II. And Jewish studies scholars don't want to talk about that because of the anti-Semitism. So here's how I resolve it. It is factually true that white Jews are disproportionately powerful. That's not anti-Semitic, that's quantifiable evidence. To think that Jews are taking their power and using it to abuse society in a conspiracy to undermine everybody else is anti-Semitic. And so folks are allowed to say that Jews have power. Folks are not allowed to say that they are using that power intentionally to bring down others for their own benefit. I find administrators can find that useful. It gives them the line that can't be crossed, because I'll give you a specific example. We had a donor who prefers to remain anonymous, who put a hold on a $2 million pledge to our university when our university president proclaimed to the Jewish newspaper that not all Zionists were welcome to be on campus, right? And immediately the anti-Semites said, look, the Jews are holding back all their money from our students who are mostly non-white and need help. Damn you Jews, right? And I said to the administration, I believe that donor withheld the money in order to leverage their power for the good, to make sure this university followed the law and gave every student equal opportunity to learn. So how you read the withholding of that money is whether or not Jewish money and power is anti-Semitic, or whether Jewish money and power is being leveraged for tikkun olam, for the common good. So the easy part, if it's good or bad, the hard part is navigating if one agrees that it was good or bad. But at least that's how I try to be real with all of that. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Joni. So we're going to start wrapping up. Dr. Dollinger, was there anything you wanted to add about what our attendees, registrants can expect for the next few weeks before we conclude?
Absolutely. Next week, we're going to dive into the civil rights. Oh, actually, here's my career mantra: complicate the narrative and deepen learning. Each week, I want to complicate whatever you thought coming in. And I hope you're getting a university-esque style level of discourse, so you will be deepened in your learning. So next week, come in with everything you thought about the civil rights movement of the 1950s, and I'm going to flip it upside down. And I want to make it really bad for you, because I want you to actually agree with me by the end on your own terms, to let go of the earlier views. And then 2 weeks from now, we're going to look at the end of the civil rights alignment between Blacks and Jews and the rise of Black power. And I'm going to flip that upside down. And all three of these are actually getting us ready for week 4. We're going to go back to the 17th century. And in 1 hour, we're going to go through 360 years of American Jews being racist, being complicit in racism, or benefiting from racism without even realizing it, to understand how in the current moment we as white Jews, for those who identify as white Jews, are being received in ways that are quite shocking to us, which I think Joni might have been inferring in that question.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dollinger. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us. Again, I know that there's it's a very sensitive conversation. So we really are so grateful that you're all coming to this space as open as possible. And we hope that you'll continue to do so over the coming weeks. And on that note, we are going to conclude today. If you do have any questions for me, please reach out. I will be sending a follow-up email with more information about the coming weeks of the series. So just want to say thank you again so much.
Take care. See you next week.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone.